Good morning, assalamu alaikum, or good evening, good afternoon, wherever you are, since we are having an audience that's across the globe. I'd like first to welcome all of you and give you a few minutes to join our various platforms. Uh, we're broadcasting on multiple Facebook pages, and hopefully that will be a way for you to access the live stream, whether in the Islamophobia Studies Center Facebook page, my own personal pages. The Northern California Islamic Council is carrying as well, AMP Bay Area. And also, you could actually access it on Twitter directly. So, if you open the Twitter link, you'll be able to have access to it in on Twitter and also LinkedIn as well. So we have multiple streams going out directly on various platforms. Also, you're able to actually engage in chat, and you could write questions on whichever platform you are actually using. Any of those platforms that have comments or chats in there, you are able to put your comments, and we'll pull those to the various speakers as the day progress. So this is a full day conference that really to focus and deal with the challenge of Islamophobia in its multiple settings. Uh, Now, this is the eighth annual conference that takes place that focuses predominantly on Europe, but also we undertake it in a comparative lens. And in particular, the conference, we often hold the conference in December in France, in Paris, France, because of the unique circumstances that France has presented on the Islamophobia front. That for a really over 15 to 20 years, there's been a considerable shift in France in such a way that targeting the Muslim population as a way to rally nationalist sentiments, to rally the notion of belonging and who constitute French or Frenchness, uh, literally the term French to the core, which often would be reduced to almost a blood test to find out if there is a DNA marker that is Frenchness, in comparison to the long history of immigration to France, beginning with the colonial period all the way up to the contemporary period. And the conference brings in researchers and individuals from a variety of backgrounds, and in particular, the European Islamophobia report is one feature that we often highlight during the conferences in France, but also others that we hold in Europe. And hopefully, the first panel today, we will have a number of presentations from country reports coming from the European report with both our colleagues, Farid and Enes, who have been working on this report for the past number of years. And now we have the latest sixth edition coming in to focus on the development in Europe. Uh, when we say that Islamophobia is a global phenomena, we're dealing with different zones where Islamophobia actually have its own manifestation and distinctive articulation. So Europe is one phenomena that has different manifestations, whether it's in France, Netherlands, Belgium, where really the process of Islamophobia or the manifestation of Islamophobia intrudes on the personal space and the body of the Muslim in a way to regulate the clothing, to regulate the religious space, regulate and control. And increasingly, this goes into intruding on issues of theology, issues of religious texts, and what could be used and not used. So it's a phenomena that in essence intruding both on the physical space, the body of a Muslim, as well as their access and articulation of the text, including contestation of halal food or the way that meat consumption in variety of settings in there. So that's one zone that has its different dynamics, and within Europe we have also different type of articulation. So we're not saying it's all the same, but you could say that Europe has its own type of manifestation of Islamophobia and a different type of zone than possibly what we find in North America. North America, for the most part, and the United States being the largest aspect of it, that the United States is predominantly dealing with Islamophobia, or the manifestation of the Islamophobia in the US zone takes the form of securitization. So it's the security infrastructure, the governing of Muslims through surveillance, through intruding on the mosque by setting up or sending out spies to monitor the Muslims, the whole notion of CVE, countering violent extremism, and also at the same time you have what you call Islamophilia, where Muslims are brought in essence, as part of what you call celebrating diversity. But it's a diversity of, in essence, it's a celebratory, symbolic diversity as long as it fits into the conduct of war on terrorism. So if we want to crystallize this notion or the phase in the United States and possibly also in the English-speaking part of Canada, what we find is this massive surveillance infrastructure that the New York case, the New York Police Department case of surveilling and mapping the community in its own spaces, or the number of paid agents that the United States had, the United States federal agency, the FBI, and other security agencies have sent on various Muslim communities. So we have the case of Craig Montoya in the Los Angeles area. We have the case in Lodi as well, with what's the Hyatt case, the upstate New York. So all these are, again, surveillance, intrusion on and monitoring the Muslim subject, and then Islamophilia, where the Muslims are celebrated symbolically within the notions of executing the war on terrorism. The third zone that we need to speak about in terms of Islamophobia on a global level is Islamophobia that is trending toward Muslim majority states that are using Islamophobia, or a form of Islamophobia that tries to identify the good Islam from the bad Islam, but doing so where the good Islam is that which extend legitimacy to the governing elite, permits and utilizes the power of the state to craft the good Islam versus the bad Islam. So the good Muslim in this Muslim majority state is the one that basically glorifies the existing ruling elite, accepts all the diktats that are coming from the central government, including, again, violations of basic rights of the society. This is both within the conservative as well as within the liberal topography of Muslim majority states. And increasingly, this has been also utilized to introduce this contestation in Western states. So, for example, countries like, say, United Arab Emirates, Egypt, and so on, will engage in pressing within the European state, the attempt to push the UK and France to uh, determine that the Muslim Brotherhood movement is a terrorist organization, and also pressing the United States as well to craft a policy to include this as part of their priority in contesting the type of Islam in Muslim majority states. So again, this is something that is unique because both parties that are engaged, or the parties that are engaged themselves, are Muslim, but crafting this contestation on state-sanctioned aspect of Islam versus what they see to be Islam that is to be contested and challenged within their state. And I think increasingly some of the funding that is coming to the Islamophobia industry is actually coming from these relationships with Muslim majorities. For example, in the United States, Daniel Pipes from Middle East Forum, who's basically either the number one or the number two, depending on which uh, uh, data you use, is one of the foremost Islamophobe in the United States. But yet he's inviting to Muslim majority countries to offer trainings on how to deal with the quote Islamist. So not only that he is promoting Islamophobia in the United States, as well as some relations to the Islamophobes in Europe, but likewise is engaged or being celebrated as a figure that can push the contestation of Muslimness within Muslim majority states and its reflection in the West. So that zone is a unique phenomena that also has to be approached in a different way than the research that we do in Europe or in the United States. The fourth zone to think about is the zone of social media, which is also a unique topography to it. One is it's instantaneous, national and transnational simultaneously, meaning that Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, TikTok, all these, they cross boundaries, even though that within each nation state, the state has utilized its power to make demands upon the social media of what could be allowed and what actually should be not allowed within their own state. And we could think about China, we could think about a number of places, Myanmar. Even today, just for the past number of days, Sudan had restrictions on social media podcasts. We would think of Kashmir, which has been under a constant lockdown from social media and communicating to the outside. Even journalists' ability to put out their stories has been have been hindered. What is unique about the social media space, again, is that its propensity to allow and give a greater oxygen to the Islamophobia industry and Islamophobes to such a level that the ability to counter it become contingent on mounting resources and ability to have an infrastructure to be able to respond to this massive avalanche. And we see that Islamophobic materials on the social media space, in particular Facebook and Twitter, have been horrendous in this. It stays on for a long period of time. In some places, like in India and so on, these posts actually generate violence against Muslims in a systematic way. So the social media space as a zone of Islamophobia is national, transnational. It's corporate in nature. A massive footprint of Islamophobia that is there, and also the ability for Islamophobic industry to share resources across boundaries without it being able to be traced in this way. So we see this both transatlantic relations through social media and through posts, but also across the Pacific Ocean or India, China, and so on. that this what actually brings Islamophobia into a global phenomena as well. And the last one that I would possibly put in there is what I call the genocide zone of Islamophobia. And the genocide zone includes the current circumstances that we find the Uyghurs in China, where the Muslim identity is directly right now is being placed within concentration camps by the Chinese government. That is in the millions, a couple, 2 million at least in terms of the data. It includes the Rohingya in Myanmar, which they already faced genocide and massive expulsion in there. It includes the circumstances of Muslims in India, both Muslims in India in general, but also Kashmir, where the Genocide Watch have already said that India is on the 7th or 8th stage of the Genocide Watch, and on a daily basis, that Muslims are being targeted in this way. And then the circumstances of the Palestinians inside the Palestinian historical Palestine, whether in Gaza and the West Bank, likewise are facing a genocidal type of discourse that is unfolding. So these are Islamophobic discourses that are specifically moving toward a genocidal type of discourse of Islamophobia, where Muslim citizenship is contested, that these are not citizens. So, for example, in the Indian election, especially in the state of Assam, where close to 5 million Muslims, or Andhra Pradesh, another state, where Muslim citizenship were removed from individuals that have been there for generation, and as such, by a stroke of a pen or a stroke of a Supreme Court that is been put in position of power by the current PGP party, in order for, in essence, contesting Muslim citizenship, but it also affects the election. And something that we're familiar here in the United States, both gerrymandering as well as limitation on voting rights for people who just have a longer historical lens. Tomorrow we will be celebrating Martin Luther King Day in the United States. One of the pillars of the civil rights movement in the 1960s was the right to vote. Because if you are not enfranchised to be able to cast your vote, and you are unable to participate in electing the representative that will reflect your best interest, then your citizenship is meaningless, because citizenship has to be reflective in the political power to choose your representative within a democratic institutions. And this is in the United States, we're facing the challenges to the Voting Rights Act at this point. And as such, to see what is underway in India in removing the voting rights of individuals, removing their total citizenship, and actually cast them to be an outsiders, makes the possibility or the warning of a possible genocide is something of utmost concern. So these are very important in terms of thinking about the genocide zone. What my at least my recommendation is that we need to be nuanced in looking at the different areas that is facing Islamophobia, and be able to articulate both a different definition of the phenomena that are underway, but more importantly, to calibrate our research to respond appropriately to the phenomena that are there. And I know that a considerable part of research has often focused on delineating media discourse and political discourse without actually thinking of the larger framing that takes place in actually pushing these Islamophobic discourses in the various settings. Lastly, I would actually add the following, that especially both in the United States and Europe, which has its reflections in other parts, this notion is of the replacement theory and the clash of civilization, which in essence positing that the Muslims' arrival, whether in the US or in Europe, is in essence is being undertaken to replace the white race. And this is interesting because in some settings, they object to use of race. They say we are equal, there is no such thing as race. But then they assert the replacement theory to replace our race. So in essence, again, I don't want to accuse those who push this to be logically consistent. I think inconsistency of their logic is the consistency of their racist attitude. So they attribute to themselves a racial category while rejecting the racial categories that they apply to the other. So it's a replacement theory of protecting of the white racial category, while at the same time rejecting that there is actually other racial categories. And I think France is possibly the paradigmatic notions where there is no recognition of race, but then whether Eric Zemmour or Marie Le Pen can actually stand and assert the preservation and the defense of the French identity, and making sure that the Frenchness of the society, which can be traced so-called to bloodline, right? Because being French to the core, meaning that you have to be French with a blood dynamics or a blood articulation, this is actually being asserted as such. So both clash of civilization replacement theory, whether it's Huntington or Camus, both of these are used and are articulated in the discourses that are there. So I wanted just to put this framing for us just to think about these different zones. And today we'll begin trying with the European report to look at Europe and in various presentations that comes from the just recently issued edition. And then later on, we'll have a number of presentations. One of it will be the newly also released report from CARE on Islamophobia in the United States and the massive expenditures that we saw over the past from 2017 to 2019, close to $105 million spent by the Islamophobic industry to demonize and create the Islamophobic discourses in the US. So thank you for being with me, and I'm gonna wait for our colleague Anas Baryakli and also Farid Hafiz to join us. And I see some of our colleagues that are waiting to present. So I'll wait for Anas to join us because he will be the one who will take the chairship for the next panel, and hopefully we'll be able to get. I don't see Anas. Do you see Anas? Oh, here we go. Anas, it's good to see you, Anas. So I'm gonna take you up to the studio to add you to the stream. Assalamu alaikum. We'll say Nasılsın. Good to see you. It's a pleasure. Anas has been a partner in some of the work that we have been doing. He presented at UC Berkeley almost every year, possibly the exception of 1 or 2 years, and also presented in the various Islamophobia conferences in Europe. He's in the Turkish-German University in Turkey. He's one of the co-editors with Professor Farid Hafiz of the European report. So I'll turn it to you, and then I'll pull everybody up to the screen for you to get, and I'll go into the background so you'll be able to take us through really the presentation on the European report. Just to say, for people to access this report, is one of the most important collection that deals with various specific countries' report on Islamophobia, and it's a monumental task, a monumental work. So really congratulating you both, Anas and Farid, for this tremendous work. That it's a work of both love and dedication to really looking at Islamophobia and how it gets to be articulated in the different settings in the European countries. So take it, Anas, and I will drop out from this presentation.
Thank you very much, Hatem, for your kind words. Others are already online. Let's see. Farid is here. Adam is here. Hikmet is here. Hi. Welcome to everybody. And Aura Ali and James Carr. Excellent. And Nadia Jones, also she is with us. So we have a quite big panel today, 6 presentations. And I would like to welcome you all on behalf of 8 Islamophobia conference. And this is the 8th year, I think. I have participated a few of them in Paris before the pandemic. And as Hatem already mentioned, we have been publishing this European Islamophobia report since 2015. This is the 6th edition we published a few weeks ago. And here today we have 6 authors, country reports, that the authors who authored the country reports, different countries. Also, Farid is the co-editor of the European Islamophobia report since the beginning, but he is also authoring, he's been authoring the Austrian country report. Adem Feri Zaj, he has authored the Kosovo report. Welcome, Adem. Welcome, Farid. And Hikmet Karjic has been authoring the Bosnia report. And welcome, Hikmet. And James Carr has been authoring, I think, a few years now, Ireland report. And the Aura Ali's Spanish report. Welcome, you all. And Nadia Jones Gailani, if I'm correct, the pronunciation. She has joined us, I think, recently and authoring the Hungary report, which is quite important. And so today we have also Hikmet and Nadia, and there is this crisis going on in Bosnia. And I think also Orban is playing a big role there also. Maybe today they will talk about this issue as well, because we cannot decouple the Islamophobia issue from what has happened in Bosnia in the 90s, the genocide in Srebrenica, and recently there has been an effort to legitimize or normalize the genocide, and especially the Nobel Prize that has been given to Peter Handke 2019, I think was a huge step in this regard, and that's why also we put this ceremony, the picture of this ceremony, on the cover page of 2019 report. So I welcome you all again, and I would like to start with Farid, who has been also co-editing the report, and maybe he will talk about the general trends in Europe in 2020. Of course, we are in the year of 2022, but we haven't published 2021 report because the year has just ended, but we are planning to publish it in the coming months. So the floor is yours, Farid. We cannot hear you. You have to open your mic.
All right, now it works. Well, thank you first of all for doing this panel. Thank you for the moderation, Enes, and thank you all other co-authors who are here today, and Hatem for again doing the 8th Paris conference. The time is really flying by, as I see here, realizing I think I was at one of the very first, I think the 2nd Paris conference that I attended. So also another huge thank, I think, that has to be said here at this point for Hatem, also for supporting the European Islamophobia report, since we now have a new framework of different academic institutions that are backing the report, starting with 2020. Let me say maybe a few words to the European Islamophobia report, to the general trends that we've seen so far. On one side, as Enes just mentioned shortly, I think in every single year we try to put some emphasis on one or two important trends that we have been observing. And what actually one of the things I think that were super important in terms of what happened in 2020 was obviously something that hit the whole world, which is the COVID pandemic, right? But nevertheless, though we had the COVID pandemic, that really shifted a lot of the discussions also to the virtual sphere. I think one of the things that nevertheless we tried to emphasize was not what happened because of the pandemic, but rather what happened in institutional ways, especially in France. And that was the reason, obviously, why we put Macron on the cover page, because we had the impression that really one of the things that really changed so dramatically was that the institutional form of Islamophobia that French Muslims had to go through and had to witness was so central to the policies that were implemented by the Macron government. Now, obviously, that is not something that came out of the blue, and I think we could already see that years before already when Macron when Macron, took office. One of the very first things that he spoke about was actually what he back then called the restructuring of French Islam. And we know this is a trend that is not specific to France. It is something that we can observe throughout the European, especially the Western European landscape, that there is an attempt by the ministries of interior that they try to shape the Islam policies of their countries. And that is in stark contrast, again, to the policies vis-a-vis other churches and religious denominations. Like, let's say, for instance, when we talk about how the Catholic Church or the Protestant Church is treated in many other Western European countries, so there are obviously lots of differences. But generally speaking, in those countries where you do have ministries of cultus or ministries of religious affairs or any state authorities who are in charge of religious affairs, then obviously that is those are the authorities that deal with churches and religious denominations. Not so in the case with Muslims, and that's especially relevant, I think, for the French case, but again, not only for the French case, because there we see that it is the Ministry of Interior that has claimed to create what it calls a French version of Islam, or an Italian or Dutch or Austrian or German or whatever. So structurally speaking, what happened in France should be of no wonder, should not astonish us in any ways. But again, the level of crackdown on the organized Muslim civil society, I think this is something that really has to be highlighted, and that was again the reason why we put Macron's cover on the cover page, Macron's face. So obviously what happened in France was, after the murder of the French history teacher Samuel Paty, there was a big crackdown by the Ministry of Interior, basically going after Muslim civil societies, but also going after organized anti-racist organizations that are tackling Islamophobia. So one of the most famous cases, but not the only one, was the closing of CCIF, the Collective Against Islamophobia in France, which then even had to physically move and have its new headquarters based now in Brussels, because they were basically prosecuted and by the French government. And I think that really shows the extent to which Muslims have become victims of state institutionalized Islamophobia. Several mosques were raided. They closed, meanwhile, since back then, more than 70 mosques. Again, in 2021, the closing of CCIF was also supported by the highest court in charge. And all of that shows us really that Muslims have become vulnerable victims of the French government. And as the Minister of Interior said, and he literally said, like, so there might not be anything right, like on which all of these measures are based, we want to send a signal. That were literally his words. And I think that shows us the extent, again, to which Islamophobia coming from state authorities can emerge. And one of the interesting things, so that happened a bit later, but that also shows us how much Islamophobia has become central to the government policies, is when a lot of people who follow the French case will recall this incident when there was this debate between the Minister of Interior from the Macron government debating with the French far-right leader Marine Le Pen. And he was basically accusing her, saying, literally, you are too soft on Islam and on political Islam. And that very much shows you how much Islamophobia has become very much mainstream. Again, the Austrian case, which I also authored, is a best example in case here, because also 2 weeks later, after this whole debate had started with after following the murder of Samuel Paty, the Austrian government, after the militant attack in downtown Vienna on the 2nd of November in 2020, a week later there was a massive raid that happened, again, not attacking anybody who was in any way related to this militant attack, but rather the mainstream Muslim civil society, also including myself, and many other people who were organizing also against the harsh policies that Muslims have been going through in Austria since 2015, when the Islam Act had been implemented. Although, again, the Austrian case is a bit much more maybe optimistic, because other than in France, when the victims went to the court, the raid was decided to be illegal or unlawful, and they actually, step by step, it seems that this whole operation is more and more revealing to become, obviously also on the side of the court, to be based on nothing but allegations and wild conspiracy theories. I mean, to give you just one example of what you can find in those files of the investigation against those people who were raided, it literally says, quote unquote, speaking about Islamophobia is to create a caliphate, is an important strategy to create the caliphate, unquote. And that again shows you very much akin to the French example, where Emmanuel Macron and the Minister of Education were very much rallying against what they saw as an American cultural and scientific influence to the French academic community, when people speak about post-colonial studies, gender studies, and racism and critical race theory. That was what they rallied against, and very similar to that we can see here for the Austrian case, when they try to mobilize against even speaking about Islamophobia, basically criminalizing any kind of critical investigation of Islamophobia being part of a terrorist attempt. And again, also for the Austrian case, all of this was done basically on the claim that there was a terrorist organization at work, and that those who were raided were basically committing terrorism, killing people, not in Austria, but overseas, in Egypt and other places, and trying to link basically every kind of self-organized Muslim agency with terrorism allegations. That is something that has been criticized even, I mean, from several important institutions, and also the European Union's Fundamental Rights Agency, that is also based in Vienna, has criticized that a lot of the terrorism legislation is basically especially problematic for vulnerable communities, which are first and foremost Muslims living in Europe. And so you have this kind of critique. You do not see that on behalf of the political leadership, that there is really any signal that these people would rethink and critically reevaluate what they have been doing, but rather they keep on fighting what they call in France Islamist separatism, in Austria political Islam, in Germany legalistic Islamism. But basically what they are meaning by that is any kind of Muslim visibility in the public space, A, and B, any kind of self-organized Muslim agency. And the third aspect, C, is that any kind of critique that is questioning the Islam policies that are implemented by those governments. So this is what this whole notion of political Islam, or however you want to call it, is basically representing, and this is what those governments are rallying against. And so we're not again in 2020, but I'm just trying to also reconnect this to several other incidents and developments that have been observed, that we could observe later on, that there is within the European Union a lobby that is working towards making these and normalizing these kinds of policies, and that is Austria, that is France, that is Denmark, and that is some circles also within the former government, within the former German government. And I think one of the things that we'll be curious about in the upcoming years is also to see how that might change with a new, more leftist government in place in Germany, or if that will basically keep going on as it was in the last 16 years under the conservative leadership. All right, I think I already took my 15 minutes, so I'll stop here, and I'm looking forward to having a nice conversation. And I'm so happy and glad really that we have different authors, all of you here, speaking of so many different also places, more from the east and the west of Europe, and also maybe discussing some of those important transnational relationships that we have. And I'm sure when we speak about Bosnia, we cannot leave out Macron, for instance, who is on one side not only focusing within the European Union to foster these kinds of policies, but also having some say when it comes to ex-Yugoslavian countries, where he also tries to push forward these counter-violent extremism projects, which are basically questioning the Muslim presence, if I can put it that bluntly. All right, so looking forward to a great discussion, and thanks again, everybody, for being here and for presenting.
Thank you very much, Farid. Thank you for your contribution. And since you mentioned last about Bosnia, I would like to move to Hikmet. And of course, what is happening is very worrying in Bosnia. And there is a real danger that things might happen again, what happened in the 90s. Even if today we think it's not possible, still people also thought that in the 90s that it is not possible in the 90s. I mean, in the 90s, Europe, and it's an enlightened world, etc. But a genocide took place. So I would like to give the floor to Hikmet, and I would like to ask him to describe the situation, what is going on, and what's the role of especially also outside actors like Macron. I also know that also Austria plays a role, especially in case of Kosovo. I remember that Austrian Prime Minister had some statements there, and the other, of course, the external actors plays a big role in Bosnia also. So the floor is yours, Hikmet. You have to open your mic.
Sorry. Thank you, Dr. Enes, and thanks to Farid and to all the other organizers for inviting me. It's my pleasure to present not only the report from 2020, but also to update you on some of the recent developments, which I think are very important to emphasize at this moment. Basically, in the last several months, things have gone from bad to worse, and in the next couple of months or weeks, things could intensify to that extent that we could have some sort of controlled clashes or controlled violence in some parts of Bosnia. And this is something which has been said by many analysts, by many people who for a long time have been viewing the situation here. Currently, we are in a position in which the EU is weak and uninterested. The far right populist and nativist actors throughout Europe are currently in a very high position of support, and they are giving support to the Serbian separatists, Bosnian Serb separatists, headed by one of the Bosnian presidents, Milorad Dodik, the Bosnian Serb president. And he very well plays with the fears of the West by talking about the Muslim problem, the Muslim threat. So what was interesting, for example, in the last few months, his rhetoric entirely changed, in which he stopped talking about Bosniaks as a national group, national and ethnic group. Rather, he started to use the term Muslim. And so he would say, if Bosnia, if things go on like this in Bosnia, and Bosnia will have a Muslim army, in the sense that the Bosniak Muslims constitute a majority of the population in Bosnia. And he's basically playing around with the great replacement theory, in which Bosniaks demographically will become a majority in the country and then have a Muslim army in the middle in the heart of Europe. So he's using this kind of rhetoric to play in the fears of the West, and he has a lot of support with far-right nativist actors throughout Europe, but also in the transnational and transatlantic sphere. So, for example, he has, of course, the main support of this anti-Muslim rhetoric and this entire political crisis right now comes again from Belgrade, from Serbia, and of course from Moscow, from Russia. So things started going south after there was a meeting between Milorad Dodik, Alexander Vučić, and Vladimir Putin several months ago, and this is in my opinion the trigger which probably Dodik was given the green light by both Vučić and by Vladimir Putin to go into this direction. And again, this type of far-right connections which he has is seen through the connections you've seen through the different meetings that he has had in the last several years. He has met with far-right organizations and actors in Europe, so parties from Hungary, from Austria, and from Germany. And recently, on the 9th of January, when this unconstitutional Republika Srpska Day was celebrated, 2 European Parliament members from Le Pen's party from France came and participated and attended this military parade. And this is probably the one of the red lines which we have seen, and that is that we have an ethnically clean Bosnian Serb police force, which is highly militarized and which is heavily armed and which is capable of basically being a paramilitary gendarmerie, which could cause large security problems in not only in Bosnia but also in the region. As we have seen, many of the things which happen in Bosnia can very quickly spill over to Serbia and to Montenegro, and in some cases also to Macedonia. So recently, the issue of the denial of Srebrenica genocide was a main issue in Montenegro itself. So if you remember, a few months ago, in mid last year, there were several attacks on mosques in Montenegro. And this was related to the new law, which was supposed to be brought by the Montenegrin government regarding the Serbian Orthodox Church. So basically, wherever Muslim minorities were positioned in Montenegro and in neighboring villages in Serbia, they were under the attack of Serb nationalists. In addition to this, we have a large number of graffitis which have been popping up all over ex-Yugoslavia, which glorify war criminals, people who were convicted of genocide, such as Ratko Mladic, and also World War II Nazi collaborators. And very interestingly, a mural of General Ratko Mladic, the mastermind behind the Srebrenica genocide, is being protected by Belgrade police officials, including the Minister of Police, Aleksandar Vulin, who personally came and laid a flower in front of this mural. So this sent a very clear message, not only to the Bosniak Muslims, but also to the Muslims of Serbia, that the official state policy is to defend the memory of genocidaires who were convicted of these horrendous crimes. In addition, what we also saw in the last 2 to 3 years is that politicians have not only started calling Bosniaks as Muslims and Turks, they basically narrowing them down to a Muslim religious group, but also they have been insulting Albanians living in Bosnia and also in Kosovo. So this is again correlated with the events going on in Kosovo, Montenegro, Sanjak, and the region. A lot of this rhetoric has been coming from neighboring countries, and the support given to Dodik has largely increased in recent months by most prominently by Viktor Orban, who previously gave very compromising statements about Muslims in Bosnia. And there was this infamous photograph of him having a meeting with Italian far-right politicians and having a demographic map of Bosnia right behind him. So this at that time was a shock 1 year ago, but recently he gave full support to Milorad Dodik for all of his actions, and he said that any attempt to sanction him from the EU will be blocked by Hungary. In addition, he also sent in 100 million euros to Dodik to support his future political plans. So this is the first time that we have direct financial support by an EU country towards Serbian separatists in Bosnia and Herzegovina. In addition, recently on Twitter, Orban's spokesperson wrote that tweeted live from a press conference, and when Orban was asked about the EU integration of Bosnia, Orban replied that the main issue with Bosnia is how to integrate 2 million Muslims into Europe. So basically, this was a direct quote from Orban, and this is the most direct statement given by a high-ranking European Union politician in order to say that the main issue with Bosnia is its Muslim population. In addition to this, in September 2021, there was the European Demographic Summit, which was organized in Budapest, and several high-ranking officials from the US and also from Europe took part in this conference, where the main topic was about the future of demographics in Europe, most specifically how to deal with the migrant crisis and with the rising Muslim population in Europe. And some of the guests who were at the conference, who talked at the conference, were Bosnian Serb President Milorad Dodik, Serbian President Aleksandar Vučić, Viktor Orban, and of course Mike Pence as a special guest. So in this case, we see that this transnational and transatlantic connections are much more higher than we initially thought. In addition to all of this said, in the recent weeks and months, we have seen an increase militarization of the Bosnian Serb leadership here, and constant meetings with Serbian officials and with Russian officials. So a very troublesome development was that the Night Wolves, basically Vladimir Putin's motorcycle paramilitary group, also took part in the 9th January parade in Banja Luka in northern Bosnia. So currently we are in a situation where Bosniak Muslims are expecting and hoping for NATO to intervene, in the sense that some sort of leverage should be placed on the country in order to counter the Russian and Serbian influence. Because if that does not happen, then we are afraid that our country may come under the large influence of the Russian sphere, and with that, any hope for EU or NATO integration in the future will be lost forever. So in the next few months, we'll definitely have some sort of much more clear picture and much more clear development. But what I am pretty sure of is that Milorad Dodik and the Bosnian Serb leadership will definitely try and gain some sort of larger independence or direct independence from Bosnia and Herzegovina, which will definitely lead to some sort of security crisis, not only in Bosnia, but also which can spill over into the whole entire Western Balkans.
Thank you very much, Hikmet, for this very deep analysis what is happening in Bosnia. And now I would like to move to Adam, that he has also authored the Kosovo report, and somehow, as Hikmet mentioned, this crisis in Bosnia is not only about Bosnia, but it might also spill over the other countries in the Balkans, and maybe Adam can depict the situation. I mean, how he sees the situation from how the old Kosovars sees the situation from Kosovo, what is happening in Bosnia, especially. And also he can comment on the Islamophobia in Kosovo, which is also an interesting case because Kosovo is a Muslim majority country, and of course this makes it also a bit special. The floor is yours, Adam.
Thank you for the invitation and the opportunity to present my research here. So let me start with the report. I will basically focus on my report, pick some points and illustrate them, discuss them. So, rooted in Europe's colonial past, Islamophobia seems to be inescapable when it comes to the power dynamic at play between the Euro-Atlantic hegemony and Kosovo's political elites. Discussions about a potential accession of this Muslim-majority country to the European Union has often led to a climate where, as Piro Regepi puts it, the nested Orientalist anxieties and Islamophobia of local elites and the EU counterparts cause them to ascertain that when Kosovo joins the EU, its Muslim subjects will be multiculturalized, that is, they must be assimilated to fit a designated identitarian representational mandate compatible with EU multicultural politics. Islamophobia is not only an understudied topic in the Kosovo context, it is also a phenomenon rendered unintelligible in a wider geopolitical setting. Race, including the racialization of Islam, tends to be banned from scholarly debates across continental Europe. Fatima El-Tayeb describes the EU's ambivalent relationship with race as follows. The key problem in addressing and potentially deconstructing Europe's ideology of racelessness might indeed be that while the implicit, though not at all subtle, racialization of Europeanness as white and Christian, and thus of racialized minorities as non-European, seems indisputable, public and too often academic discourse nonetheless rejects this observation as meaningless within an intellectual framework shaped by an Enlightenment universalism that for centuries has managed to claim race as irrelevant while simultaneously treating it as all-important. And these discursive structures have been imported by Kosovo's political elites in an attempt to convince their Western counterparts of their Europeanness. In the 2018 report, Dynamics and Characteristic of Albanian Islamophobia within Discourses in Kosovo, stigmatizing both Muslimness in the diaspora and in the Muslim majority homeland, were elaborated. The 2019 report pointed to how central figures of the European Islamophobia network, like the former German social democrat Thilo Sarrazin, the Austrian Nobel laureate novelist Peter Handke, and the French far-right Islam critic and now presidential candidate Eric Zemmour, attacked Kosovo's statehood. This year's report will suggest that the distinction between external and internal Islamophobia in the Kosovo context is misleading, for Islamophobia cannot simply be divided into subsections, rather it is expressed differently according to changing circumstances. I decided to give this short introduction in order to sketch the general outline of Islamophobia in Kosovo, a Muslim majority country with 96% of its population being Muslim. And in the following, I will pick a few examples from my 2020 report to illustrate Islamophobia in Kosovo. Before I get to the conclusion, I will highlight political and cultural initiatives to counter Islamophobia. The construction of the central mosque in Pristina. Nearly 8 years after the foundation stone was laid, the construction of a new mosque called Jamia Cendrore, which means Central Mosque, to be built in the city center of Pristina started on July 15, 2020. The debate following the announcement of the construction of Pristina's new mosque could be characterized as one of the topics that was discussed in the most controversial manner in 2020. Protests expressing discontent with the building of the mosque took place in Pristina on July 22, which also generated protests in favor of the building. Although relatively small in numbers and scope, the anti-mosque protests were disproportionately reported in newspapers and television channels. On the one hand, there were Islamophobic outbursts during these discussions. Perhaps one of the most famous outbursts was the op-ed published by Kosovo's most popular newspaper, Gazeta Express, quote, this religion, Islam, is primitive and is embraced by primitive and lazy people in the Near and Middle East. We, the Albanian people, have not benefited in any way from these peoples, really nothing good. And interestingly, the author uses the Quranic and Albanian word khair for good here. On the other hand, there were also public figures who spoke out against Islamophobia on this occasion. One example is the theologian Mustafa Bayrami, referring to reports on Islamophobia published by the European Union that argue that Islamophobia is an elite project in Kosovo, small in number, but huge in effect. And the assumption here is that incongruences exist between the elite's hegemonic positions regarding Islam and the population's diverse lived practices derived from different Islamic traditions. Now let me move on to politics. In Kosovo, anti-Americanism was a word used in many key political debates in 2020. It arose in a context of a Kosovo governmental foreign policy trying to safeguard its interests against Serbia in a way that the Trump administration, and especially US Special Envoy to Kosovo Richard Grenell, had directly advised against. Led by Prime Minister Albin Kurti, this government was dissolved a few weeks later, on March 25, 2020. Some international commentators alluded to the event as a coup d'etat. The inflationary use of anti-Americanism in political discourse is conspicuous. On the one hand, it suggests that politicians are aware of how their position as a small and relatively powerless Muslim majority country can easily be transformed into Islamophobic arguments against them. On the other hand, reproducing Islamophobia in the Kosovo context because of a lack of agency is nothing less than the enhancement of a vicious circle that eventually works against Kosovo's foreign policy interests by reinforcing Islamophobic stereotypes that are associated with Albanians in Western political discourse. The second event I want to address is the economic normalization agreement between Serbia and Kosovo that was reached at the White House on September 4, 2020. Former US President Donald Trump announced this diplomatic arrangement as follows on Twitter, quote, "Another great day for peace with Middle East. Muslim majority Kosovo and Israel have agreed to normalize ties and establish diplomatic relations. Well done. More Islamic and Arab nations will follow soon." If one puts this statement in the context of the rising popularity of the far-right Islamophobic view on Kosovo in European discourse, one could suggest that Trump's use of racist semantics, meaning denying Albanian indigenousness to Europe due to the Muslimness, is alerting. Now, I'd like to switch to the media section. In 2020, the rising popularity of far-right discourses in Euro-Atlantic circles continued to impact negatively the way Western media reported on Kosovo. To what extent this can lead to blatant Islamophobia against Kosovo is demonstrated by an article in the New York Times stating, this is a quote, "Kosovo's most famous exports are jihadists." Furthermore, this polemic piece of writing was built around the right-wing extremist Great Replacement theory, according to which Orthodox Christian Serbs, as real Europeans, lost Kosovo to Oriental Muslim Albanians after the war ended in 1999. Now, an interesting case happened in the justice system in 2020 in Kosovo. On December 30, the Kosovo media reported that the Basic Court of Pristina decided that Indira Mujaj, who was fired from her job as police officer in 2015 due to her headscarf, can return to her previous position. Hereby, the court issued an important precedent that will be of importance in the ongoing question of whether it is allowed for civil servants to wear the hijab. Up to this day, controversies regarding the wearing of headscarves in public institutions are ongoing. And there was also another Islamophobic incident on the internet. On October 19, 2020, Kosovo's ambassador to France, Cendrem Gashi, retweeted an article of Le Figaro featuring the Charlie Hebdo Mohammed caricatures, and this post caused headlines in Kosovo. Condemning the terrorist murder of the teacher in France, the Islamic community of Kosovo criticized Gashi's behavior for contributing to intolerance and hatred based on religion, while demanding the country's foreign ministry distance itself from this undiplomatic act. When it comes to central figures in the Islamophobia network, it has to be stated that Islamophobia in Kosovo is diffuse and has to be contextualized in the current inescapability of Eurocentrism. However, Islamophobia also circulates in Western discourses about Kosovo, especially in far-right political circles. This disconcerting phenomenon was elaborated in last year's report and includes widely known figures in Europe like Austrian novelist Peter Handke, German former politician Thilo Sarrazin, far-right Islam critic and Eric Zemmour, and just to mention a few names. And this year's events have shown that prominent figures like former US President Donald Trump, far-right Alternative für Deutschland politician Andreas Winhardt, and the French conservative politician Eric Ciotti should be included in the global network, reproducing Islamophobia while using the example of Kosovo. It should also be noticed that these Islamophobic views on Kosovo are rooted in Serbian nationalism. Since populist far-right parties are still on the rise in Europe, this development is not likely to stop in the next years. And now, before I conclude, I'd like to point out a few cultural initiatives that can give us hope. The culture scene witnessed several works addressing the effects of anti-Muslim racism directed against the Albanian diaspora in the West. For example, a 2020 theatrical work, The Return of Karl May, entertaining play for the German people, tackled the Orientalist and Islamophobic depiction of Albanians in German-speaking discourses since the 19th century. Then there was a rap album called Fast Life 2 by Azet and Albi, which was one of the most important releases in Germany in 2020 and represents a detailed illustration of diasporic Albanian life in German-speaking Europe, including the racialization and criminalization of Muslim masculinities. And the last example I'd like to give is a movie called Exile by Visar Morina, a German Albanian, Kosovo Albanian filmmaker. And in this movie, he demonstrated how racism, as experienced by the Albanian diaspora in Germany, is rooted in Islamophobia by illustrating that even the most assimilated Albanian is not capable of escaping from the image of being the Muslim in the workplace. Now I have a few minutes to conclude. So in 2020, Islamophobia in Kosovo showed two different tendencies. On the one hand, anti-Muslim tropes within mainstream Kosovo discourses were reproduced. Yet, unlike previous years, these tropes were often challenged by public figures. On the other hand, Islamophobic arguments against Kosovo, especially put forward by extreme right-wing circles, are on the rise in Europe and represent a blind spot in the fight against anti-Muslim racism. Given the current political trends in Europe favoring populist right-wing parties, this development is likely to increase in the next years. Therefore, countering this global Islamophobia network, including influential personalities like Peter Handke, Tilo Sarrazin, Erik Zemmour, is of primordial importance. So, thank you. This was it from my side.
Thank you very much, Adam. Without further delay, I would like to move to Nadia for her presentation of Hungary, and I would ask her also to comment on the recent remarks from Orban and the reasons behind it. What she thinks of these statements. Is it domestic politics related, or she thinks there is much more about this? And the floor is yours, Nadia.
Thank you very much. Thanks for the invitation to be here. I'm going to present from the 2021 report as well, or the 2020 report. I think Hungary is an interesting example of a country with a small Muslim population, which nevertheless has a very real and virulent narrative of Islamophobia. So compared to other countries that are covered in the report, Hungary might in fact be sidelined, since without insider knowledge of the political situation and the state of government-controlled media, it is difficult to understand how to make sense of the numbers in comparison to the national narrative. So I've been preparing the report on Hungary with co-author Gabi Goebel for the last 3 years, and our findings continue to highlight how the anti-migration narratives that target Muslims in Hungary continue to be at the forefront of the Fidesz, or the government party, agenda to reconstitute a climate of fear for those who would, quote unquote, invade Europe. With the majority of the country's media controlled by the government, the so-called migrant threat that Hungary faces is reiterated effectively even when the numbers reflect a significant different reality. Since 2018, the government has repeatedly emphasized the historical Christian identity of the country in its campaigns, and Viktor Orban, Hungary's prime minister, is vocal, as others have already mentioned, is vocal in both national and international channels about rejecting the possibility of Muslims being integrated into Hungarian society. After speaking about migration in Brussels with European Commissioner President Ursula von der Leyen in 2020, Orban stated publicly that in Hungary, we do not think a mixture of Muslim and Christian society could be a peaceful one and could provide security and a good life for people. The anti-migration campaign and securitization have been gradually extended from the constructed image of the migrant other to other enemies of the Hungarian illiberal state, and this has been ongoing now for several years. The focus of the state's campaign is on internal actors, largely civil society organizations, but also independent media, the judiciary system, academic and cultural institutions, and political opposition parties. Organizations that previously worked in concert with civil society community in Hungary, such as the Open Society Foundation and Central European University, both funded by George Soros, have been forced to relocate to Germany and Austria, respectively. And Gabby and I, who authored the report from Hungary, both work at Central European University, which is now, as many of you may know, a university in exile and an institution that's also been at the heart of this government attack. So it's interesting to note that the estimated population of Muslims in Hungary in 2020 was 50,000, which only makes it 0.5% of the total population. Yet Islamophobia continues to be a strong undercurrent in Hungarian political discourse and also in the regional discourse, drawing primarily upon historical but also deeply embedded anti-Semitic and anti-Roma sentiments. News outlets have reported over the past 5 years on how the continued demonization of the figure of the migrant is used as a scapegoat for the country's social and economic conditions. Central to the pro-government news platforms are illustrations that present racialized photos of quote-unquote Muslim men desperately walking Europe's borders. In 2019, the government also passed a number of laws making it illegal to provide information or resources to migrants, but also on migration to Hungary, driving watchdog organizations such as Mixol, Migrant Solidarity Group Underground, and further eroding connections between Muslim grassroots community organizations and the civil society framework. According to a Muslim community leader, most of the Hungarian population is suspicious of Muslims, especially in regions where they are more visible due to their clothing or practice. We were also told by an imam in Budapest that the terror attacks in Paris and Vienna had initiated waves of racial hatred targeting Muslims, both online but also in physical spaces, with examples being the vandalism of local mosques. Conspiracy theories linked to migrants and Muslims in Hungary, including the infamous Soros plan to illegally settle over 1 million Muslim migrants throughout Europe, continue to be a popular rhetorical device that's frequently employed by pro-government media sources. These sources continue to allege that illegal border crossing attempts have increased massively since the pandemic began. In fact, the number of asylum claims made in Hungary have dropped substantially. In May 2020, the Court of Justice of the European Union ruled that the practice of constructing prison-like transit zones, such as those in Hungary, was illegal. The Hungarian government has effectively removed itself from the common European asylum system by shifting the responsibility of registering asylum claims to Serbia. According to the Hungarian Helsinki Committee, the rate of admission has declined from roughly 10 people per working day in 2016 to perhaps 1 person per day by 2018. In 2019, only 22 people received refugee protection in Hungary, a country with a population of roughly 10 million people. In early March 2020, Orbán blamed a group of Iranian students studying in Hungary for bringing the coronavirus to the country. Authorities accused the Iranian students of breaching the quarantine rules and consequently expelled them from Hungary. Government statements repeatedly underlined the students' alleged aggressive behavior, while Orbán publicly linked illegal migration to the spread of coronavirus and to other Muslim nations. Represented by a lawyer from the Hungarian Helsinki Committee, one of the students concluded that the decision was a politically motivated show trial, and the accusations were never proven and the charges were eventually dropped. In response to the Vienna terror incident, Hungarian Islamic community leader Zoltán Bolek was told in a public broadcast that Islam should be banned and that Bolek should disappear and that he was a welfare Muslim in Hungary. The majority of Islamophobic and racially motivated attacks either remain unreported or uninvestigated as hate crimes. And part of the problem with this, part of the problem we face every year in preparing the report is appealing to the Ministry for Statistics with very little result. 2020 was an important year in terms of legislative changes impacting the fundamental law of Hungary. The government used the pandemic in the spring of 2020 to gain sweeping powers as part of a state of emergency and passed what it called the Enabling Act. This act reduces limitations on the duration of the term of parliamentary oversight for the party in power. Freedom House and others have warned that these changes to the fundamental law mean that Hungary can no longer be considered a democracy. And as part of these changes, legislation was passed to ensure that all children born in Hungary are brought up based on national self-identification and a commitment to Christianity. Furthermore, the Equal Treatment Authority, a body previously tasked with ensuring equal treatment in the workplace and in public life, have been abolished, thus depriving groups who are the target of hate crimes of having a say. Attempts to curb the spread of hate speech and misinformation across social media platforms like Facebook and Twitter since 2018 have been largely unsuccessful in Hungary, since organizations quickly rebrand in order to continue their online activities. An anonymous poster in a Facebook group for Hungarians living in Austria after the Vienna attack stated that, I quote, "I seriously would eliminate such garbage. They should be shot dead right after they come out of their mothers alongside their families." There are other sources that claim to have jihad or to have a jihad observer or jihad watcher. And a lot of these sources frequently cite Geert Wilders and other right-wing politicians who speak out specifically about Muslim migration to Europe. Kuruc.info is another source inciting hatred, targeting in particular Jews and Roma communities. The site is a hotbed of misinformation and even calls for a Jewish confrontation. Confronting Islamophobia and xenophobic stereotypes remains an uphill struggle for the relatively small number of NGOs and grassroots initiatives who continue to work to counter government propaganda. The Hungarian Islam Advocacy Association is one of the only remaining Hungarian NGOs fighting for Muslim rights. Balázs Bako, leader of the organization, mentions that expanding the membership of the organization is difficult because people fear becoming targets of Islamophobia. The Mendik Association for Migrants continues to hold workshops in local schools that attempt to educate people about the strong prejudices against Muslims, which are fueled again by government propaganda. One of the central figures that I've mentioned previously in combating Islamophobia in Hungary remains the Hungarian Helsinki Committee, which is a human rights NGO protecting human dignity through legal and public activities. The organization also supports refugees, detainees, and victims of law enforcement violence. So in conclusion then, the ruling government party in Hungary continues to instrumentalize parliamentary legislation to promote its ideology and political agenda. By observing the democratic backsliding since Fidesz gained power in 2010, Gabi and I remain concerned about the dismantled system of checks and balances and how this leaves both domestic and international institutions essentially unable to either influence the Hungarian government or hold it accountable for its actions. This continued assault on democracy in Hungary by its own governing party gives no cause for any optimism. In order to combat the rampant xenophobia and intolerance against minorities, people of color, and the small community of Muslims in Hungary, it's imperative that independent media and cooperation between human rights advocates, NGOs, and expert groups should be allowed to exist and function without the fear of reprisal. There also needs to be a whole-scale restoration of the independence of the judiciary system above all, and equally as important, a return to freedom of education and expression, both of which have been severely damaged since 2018. And furthermore, we were advocating also for a more sustained push by the EU on member state compliance with community values and the rule of law. Thank you.
left, James Carr and Aura Ali. I think I will start with Aura Ali, and she will present Spain, and she has been also contributing to our report in the last years. I think this is the second or third year, if I'm not mistaken. Sorry, I can't remember very well since there are more than 30 countries in the report. But the floor is yours.
So, well, thank you for the invitation, and thank you for organizing this, and also for this showing of all the global picture, because the more I listen to, the more I see that depending on where you are, Islamophobia always manifests in a different way, but it's always there, and at the bottom of it all, the same theories really are there. So I will just start with a little introduction on Spain's Muslim communities, and just to put the base on what I will explain later. According to recent statistics, around 2 million Muslims reside in Spain. That is approximately 4% of the overall population. Of those, more or less half of them have the privilege of the citizenship, and and the other half has a migrant status. A lot of times this migrant status might last 30 years, 25 years, etc. So in 1992, this is 3 decades ago, the 1992 agreements were signed between the Islamic Spanish Commission and the Spanish state. These agreements legislate fundamental issues such as access to halal food in public buildings such as hospitals, schools, and so on, the access to religious Islamic education, the right to be buried in the Islamic ritual. This is to have a space within the cemetery, within each of the local cemeteries. The right to be in the military, in the security forces, and so on. Also, the festivities, El Eid, and so on. So 3 decades later, we can say actually not even 5% of this has been met. Most of the issues that have to do with discrimination have to do with the non-compliance with these agreements. And the actual ignoring these agreements, everybody knows they are there, but the non-wanting to acknowledge them. So in Spain, anti-Muslim hatred is very entrenched with anti-Moorish hatred. It's very important to understand the figure of the Moor. The Moor is a very, it's really a product of the political scene, of the mainstream media, of history books, and just to explain a little bit more, within the Royal Spanish Academy Dictionary, it has up to 12 different meanings, including the Muslims that were in Spain, that were Spain's population from the 8th to the 15th century, people coming from the Maghreb or from Morocco, any Muslim in general, converts, non-converts, we all somehow become the other Moor. So yeah, so it also means, according to this dictionary, a jealous and possessive man that dominates his partner. So this dictionary example is only one example out of many that we can see in school textbooks, in films, in series, and so on. So yeah, well, in 2020, while national or nationalized Muslim populations are not exempt from discrimination, including violence, non-national Muslims frequently feel excluded when it comes to housing, employment, healthcare, education, legal aid, freedom of movement, freedom of expression, freedom of association, and so on. This gap between Spanish and foreign citizens became even more evident during the first state of alarm and lockdown, and the obligatory confinement due to the COVID-19 pandemic that happened from March to June last year. So I want to speak not so much on the sections of the report, but also on the lack of acknowledgement by the state authorities and successive numerous governments, because this is a problem that we have now since very long, is the lack of acknowledgement of long-lasting and rising anti-Muslim hatred and violence. On one side, we have the ignored calls from civil society by the Hate Crime National Office to include anti-Muslim hatred as a separate category, while every year adding more and more and more categories. We have categories where there might be 1, 2, 3 incidents, and we know that anti-Muslim incidents are mounting approximately to up to 200, 300 that we can count, that we grassroots anti-racist organizations that are not receiving any public funds or any private funds in reality to monitor, but we are receiving these reports. So how can it be that it is not recognized as a separate category? Also, the blending omission of the Muslim communities in the 90 pages long proposal for equal treatment and non-discrimination presented at the beginning of 2021 by the Socialist Party, though including specifically other vulnerable or not so vulnerable communities. Nowhere in those 90 pages we can find the words Muslim, Islamophobia, anti-Muslim hatred, hijab, right to education, and so on. So to sum up, monitoring anti-Muslim racism remains an arduous, volunteer-based, and unsystematic task. Entities receiving public funds to combat Islamophobia do not monitor. In fact, while combating Islamophobia, they are also receiving public funds to combat violent Islamic radicalization. So why is this is not acknowledged? Because what we can feel is really that there are too many issues that are reportable. So if we were to be recognized, we could be reporting a lot of state policies. So according to a survey of the Spanish Observatory of Racism and Xenophobia, Muslims, this is the feeling of the Muslims, it's a survey done among Muslims, are perceived as the least valued social group along with the Roma. Respondents believe political discourse 74%, terrorist acts 73%, and media narratives 70% contribute to the increase of Islamophobia. They maintain there are high levels of Islamophobia in Spain, 82%, such as when renting a house, when accessing to the labor market, or to places of prayer. Muslim entities affirm that discrimination materializes in difficulties when settling into a neighborhood. For example, when a mosque is going to open, not really a mosque, but a prayer room, there will be ongoing campaigns that can last years and years and years for this room not to be open. So in 2020, we had different physical attacks. It is really important to note that most of the physical attacks that we know of is because somebody recorded it with the mobile and uploaded it into the online sphere. Okay, so of course, if we are not recognized as a category, why should we really go to the police, who is also the one that treats us bad, while police brutality and so on? We have no, there is a lot of mistrust on the security forces. So a lot of the times victims might not want to report, but it has been thrown online. So I would put this in 3 groups. On one hand, we have women. Several visibly Muslim women were beaten up in different parts of the country, including with hijab pulling and in some cases in front of their children, and with a usual passive public. We can see that in the videos, how the people are just watching, and nobody's going to separate them. No one really minds, and everybody's recording with their mobile. So another category would be the children, a part of the children that have to witness their mothers getting beat up, also that suffer the bullying at school and with the terrorist jokes. There are other children that are a big target for political parties, neo-Nazi hate groups, and with the compliance of the media. They are the so-called MENAs. MENA stands for Unaccompanied Migrant Minors. They come mostly from the Maghreb. No exact figures exist on the number of these youngsters in Spain. They might be from maybe 10,000 to 20,000. Since 2019, the UN Committee on the Rights of the Child has adopted 14 decisions against Spain for violating the rights to identity, to be heard, and to special protection of children deprived of their family environment. When becoming 18, they are expelled from institutional premises and end up squatting wherever possible. So they are children, and then they are just thrown out on the street, and of course they will squat. And then there's neo-Nazi groups, or this has been going on since I think 2019. Neo-Nazi groups organized on social media to hunt MENAs. They promote the constant harassment of unaccompanied foreign minors and even encourage neighbors to exercise violence against them by spreading hoaxes online with the complicity of mainstream media. They later meet at the home where they know these minors live, even though this information is supposed to be confidential, to harass and chase them, even if the police is there just standing, not really pushing them out. This has been happening all over Spain, like in very different and places. Also, it's not they are going to hunt MENAs, because what the collective imaginary understands under these letters is very similar to half of the 2 million Muslims that live in Spain. So a lot of the times there are hate crimes or hate aggressions where a young man or a young boy will be just like insulted as a MENA, so it's also an indicator, really. And also during the lockdown, there was an important rise on police brutality on racialized, visibly Muslim men or from the Maghreb. And it was interesting because thanks to the lockdown and thanks to the people that were in their homes, a lot of people recorded it, and bless them, because many reported it to these grassroots anti-racist organizations. And there is a very important report done by Rights International Spain that shows this how it all went, because these men were wearing masks. They had their permit to be on the street because a lot of them were suffering mental illnesses, so they had to go to the doctor, but they were actually beaten up before even asking them for the documentation, or there was no reason to be stopped. So so I think I have my time off, but I will be very open to answer any questions. I also invite you to read this the part from Spain in the report, as this is too little time to go over all. Thank you.
Thank you, Aurora. Thank you for your presentation. And let me remind you that you can download the whole report from Islamophobia.report.com web address. It is available online. And now I would like to move to our last presentation. It is about Ireland. And of course, Irish case is a little bit interesting. We don't hear much about Ireland. It is not really covered in all these discussions. It is somehow on the corner of Europe. We are talking about UK most of the time, but not Ireland. So James Carr, he's working on this issue for a long time now, and has authored the reports on Ireland in the European Islamophobia report in the last years. The floor is yours, James. Thank you for your contribution also.
Thanks, Enes, and thanks to all my colleagues today, and also to the organizers of the event as well. It's interesting when we talk about the Irish case, because I tend to encounter, whether it's in the academic space or whether it's in the even in just when I'm on the the research trail, if you will, doing my work, different responses from people when I mention Islamophobia in the Irish context. And from non-Muslims, I tend to get this this sort of thing, is Islamophobia a thing in Ireland? Is it an issue here? Are there many Muslims here in Ireland, for example? For the record, there are approximately 1.5% to 2% Muslims account for of the national population here. And we have established Islamic institutions in the state now for a number of decades. So Muslims aren't new here or a novelty here in terms of a population group. The responses from within Muslim communities are interesting in themselves. And again, depending on who you speak with, you have this an acknowledgement that anti-Muslim racism is a reality here in Ireland. And as you will see as I go on, there are striking similarities with what we see across Europe and further afield. But not only is there this sort of idea that, an acknowledgement of anti-Muslim racism being a thing in Ireland, there's also this sort of discounting of it as an issue. So people will say, look, it's a problem, but it's not as bad in Ireland as it is in the United Kingdom, for example, or in France or otherwise. Now, it is true that the overt targeted securitization of Muslim communities and the mainstreaming of anti-Muslim political discourses and practices evident in other states, as covered in the European Islamophobia report for 2020 and previous iterations, they're not on the same scale in Ireland, or don't manifest maybe on the same scale in Ireland. However, I don't think we should enter into a sort of a debate about how bad something has to be for it to be recognized and for it to be challenged and taken on properly. So Islamophobia in Ireland is an issue, and it is something that we need to tackle urgently. In the short time that I have with you today, I want to draw on the report to elaborate on some of the realities of anti-Muslim racism in the Irish context. And as will become clear as I go on through my presentation or my discussion, the manner in which Islamophobia manifests in Ireland is strikingly similar to the broader European and global context. What this means for the future of anti-Muslim racism, as I said, is a point I'll return to below. I want to start very briefly, just giving you some sort of idea of the kind of the really lived, minute sort of experiences of Islamophobia. And in terms of statistics, similar to very many jurisdictions, if we look across the OSCE region, for example, Ireland is very similar in the sense that our data at an official level on Islamophobia is really, really poor. It's poor in terms of the recording practices and processes. It's also poor in terms of what's published. Very few data get published, and it's really irregular. Data from third-party organizations are good and they're useful, but they're also limited in how they provide insights into Islamophobia in the Irish context. In particular, we can get some use from qualitative data from third-party sources, and to provide some interesting insights on how Islamophobia is in the Irish state, and that while it's different, again, there is this pattern. You can see the pattern coming through in the experiences here. So if we take manifestations of hostility and discrimination in Ireland targeting Muslim communities, it's clear that in the physical abuse and the verbal abuse that people experience, how it manifests, you can see that Muslimness is constructed as being alien to what it means to be Irish, and that Muslims are quote unquote foreign satanic cultists, to draw on one far-right actor here, that Muslims should go back to their country, that Muslims and Islam are associated with terrorism. And this kind of language is not something that is, I suppose, just on the fringes of Irish society either. We saw, as detailed in the 2020 report on Ireland, where one prominent international business leader from Ireland publicly suggested that Muslim men in particular, should be the focus of security checks at airports, as terrorists, quote, will generally be males of Muslim persuasion, end quote. In the context of discrimination, a report from the Irish Network Against Racism in Ireland, from their online reporting tool, detailed the manner in which a Muslim woman was, for example, subjected to a denial of service at a public office unless she removed her hijab. Now, there is no legal requirement for her to do so. But again, we see this pattern that we see so familiar in other jurisdictions coming through in the experiences of Muslim people here. In education, in the educational context, while some schools have been really open and inclusive and provide facilities for prayer, allow the wearing of hijab, for example, within schools, others prohibit the wearing of hijab amongst the Muslim student cohorts. And also they do this on the basis of some sort of notion of health and safety, and that is not part of the uniform code. In policing in Ireland, we've seen some positive changes. We see opening up for internships and from within minority communities, including minority religious communities. We see the hijab, for example, changes in uniform that will permit Muslim women to go into policing in Ireland should they choose to wear the hijab. If they want to do so, they can do that. But questions also remain in this sort of, in the policing space, where we have these ideas of community policing blending in or mixing in with ideas around countering violent extremism. So the same police might be doing the same sort of task. In the social media space, toxic online abuse, again, we see the same thing coming through. Very high profile case in the 2020 report, wherein a Muslim man who's elected to high local office is targeted for some very, very toxic abuse online. In the mainstream media, as the report details for 2020, Muslim communities, the reporting on Muslim communities remains consistent with previous reports in the Islamophobia report in Ireland. The collocation, again, we see of Muslim or Islam or Islamic with terms such as terrorism and extremism. In the aftermath of the attacks in Paris, Nice, and Vienna in 2020, for example, the language used in mainstream media reports includes terms such as Muslim extremists or clash of two different cultures or Muslim attackers and religious terrorism. All of these, as we know, have stigmatizing and racializing effects on Muslim communities. What I want to do for the time that remains, I want to spend some time discussing the political landscape, because this speaks more to what I see as how Islamophobia can develop here further, and the sort of potential for it to develop, and the worrying trends, if I can say that, of Islamophobia in the Irish context. Now, from outside of Ireland, those who aren't familiar with Irish political history, we haven't had the traditional sort of right-left divide. And that's really informed by our civil war, which was just 100 years ago this year, and the parties who were pro or against, or on different sides at least, in the civil war, in civil war politics. Now, in the decades since, mainstream parties have implemented policies that would be right-wing, centre-right, or indeed far-right policies, in the absence of groups explicitly identifying as far-right. Despite this explicit historical absence, in the last general election, as detailed in the report for 2020, 30 candidates espousing far-right positions ran in that general election in Ireland. These far-right parties and candidates included candidates from the National Party, the Irish Freedom Party, from groups such as Anti-Corruption Ireland, and to be honest, they all performed fairly dismally in the election. Thankfully, I would say, the highest vote returns for any of these candidates sat around 2%, give or take. The tickets that these actors ran on included anti-immigration and anti-Muslim positions. And I want to read you just a few quotes, or a couple of quotes at least, from some of the online and indeed offline campaigning. And the connection with broader anti-Muslim rhetoric from the international sphere is obvious in some of these quotes, as you will see. For example, for the safety of Irish people, Anti-Corruption Ireland will close mosques until we know what is being preached in them. Islam promotes child marriage, female genital mutilation, the subjugation of women, rape within marriage, barbaric halal and jihad against Christians. Hashtag vote for the candidate 2020. And another quote from the same person. For more female genital mutilation, ISIS training camps in our mountains, imams promoting child marriage, jihadi factories, subjugation of women and barbaric halal, vote for Sinn Féin and the Marxist left today. To end it, vote Gemma 2020. Similarly, although he did not run in the election himself, footage circulated online of Justin Barrett, the leader of the National Party, in which he claimed that in 50 years' time, Ireland will be, quote, Ireland will be nationalist and free or under Sharia law. Although not associated with the figures mentioned thus far, it is worth noting that an independent candidate elected in the southeast of the country has in the past made comments regarding people seeking asylum in Ireland, suggesting that that asylum seekers, that is, have been infiltrated by ISIS. In terms of far-right activities in Ireland, Europol, for example, note that there is a growing anti-immigrant movement consistent with the right-wing ideology in the Irish state. In terms of the actual far-right actors, in addition to running for office and their online presence, some of their public offline activities in 2020 included protesting outside Eid al-Fitr celebrations at a national stadium, protesting outside mosques, challenging what they call as the Islamization of Ireland, tropes around population replacement and creeping Sharia. And this all sounds familiar to what we're doing, right, for people working in the space and for Muslim communities who are familiar with the dynamics of Islamophobia. When it comes to growing their base, far-right groups in Ireland, such as the National Party and the Irish Freedom Party and others such as the Yellow Vest movement, again, which is connected to the Freedom Party, they utilized COVID-19 and the pandemic in 2020 and since indeed as a recruitment platform, drawing on conspiracy theories and anti-mask and anti-lockdown positions. One of the protests against pandemic restrictions in 2020 included a colour party from a tiny ultra-Catholic faction known as Síl na hÉireann, led by Neil McConnell. McConnell has previously spoken at the European Union Parliament at an event there where he asserted that jihadi Islamists were being brought to Europe by the Zionist elite. McConnell ran as a candidate in the general election in 2020. He returned something like 500 votes. I mean, there was nothing. However, he's an interesting case as an individual, kind of really demonstrating the far right in Ireland and how it's manifesting and its potentialities, if you will. In the context of the Irish far right, McConnell, like others, has connections to extreme far right groups based internationally, resonating with a point made by Europol, who state that far-right actors in Ireland are connected to a strong international network involving right-wing extremists from other European countries and the United States. Previous Islamophobia reports have highlighted these connections between the far-right space here in Ireland and also in their international counterparts, including Pegida, Tommy Robinson of English Defence and League and others fame, the identitarian movement in Europe and others. McConnell has engaged in online platforms with members of various far-right groups, including the NDP in Germany, the New Right, Democrazia Nacional, Europa Terra Nostra, Forza Nuova, members of the British National Party, and others associated with the Christian militant group Knights Templar International, as well as Golden Dawn and so on, and the Alliance for Peace and Freedom. It is this connectivity of the far right and associated discourses that is arguably most troubling, as I mentioned earlier, of the 2020 report for Ireland, and the potential for anti-Muslim discourses and practices active in other EU states to be imported to the Irish context with a veneer of legitimacy. Some of you will have read the piece by Shada Islam, for example, and the role of the EU presidency. Over the last number of years, as I've been documenting the Islamophobia in Ireland, it's this far right element that seems to be developing more and more. It's still small, but it's not getting traction at the ballot box. But the question remains, what needs to happen for that to change? Internationally, we've encountered the perspective that Islamophobia has passed the dinner table test, as noted from the UK, that it is more acceptable or an accepted form of racism. Evidence from an experimental study was conducted in Ireland in 2019 and is detailed in the 2020 report, indicates that Ireland also fits this billing. While it may not be as bad as other national contexts, Ireland is certainly no exception to the current of anti-Muslim racism circulating internationally. As such, action must be taken sooner rather than later to challenge it. Just before I conclude, it is anticipated that in this year, 2022, Ireland will enact legislation to challenge hate crime and hate speech. Furthermore, Ireland has committed to publishing a new National Action Plan on Racism, a first for well over a decade now. The European Islamophobia report has played an important role, in fact, in informing the committee that's drafting this new plan to challenge anti-Muslim racism in Ireland through the National Action Plan on Racism, or against racism. In addition, the Irish state would do well to take advantage and take heed of a few of the recommendations that are detailed in the European Islamophobia report for 2020 for Ireland. And these include, for example, that the recording of anti-Muslim racism is improved tremendously, in fact, that discrimination and hostility targeting Muslims is recorded, is captured, and that we can build greater trust with Muslim communities as well at the level of the state. And it also needs to be published more regularly than it is now, as mentioned at the outset. Trust has to be built with the communities, and we need to see this breaking up of policing from community policing and other roles as well. And state institutions must take greater action with the role of the far right in the Irish context. As we've seen in other contexts, listening to some of the comments that were made by Nadia, for example, around in the Hungarian context and what we see across in Bosnia and otherwise, the way the far right activity there has come so much to the fore, and we can see the political capital that's being used for this. My fear in the Irish context is that while heretofore we have been somewhat safer, that we could have more negative and greater negative realities in the future. Thank you.
Thank you very much, James. And now we have concluded the presentations, and now we can move on to questions section. There are a few questions I can see, and there's the first question is directed to Farid Hafiz. Just a second. Okay. Thanks for this clear explanation, Professor Hafiz. I would like to know what happened with the fabricated case brought against you in Austria. I think that is very relevant to this issue. I think you mentioned the case a little bit, but if you would like to comment more, Farid, the floor is yours. We cannot hear you. The mic is not, yeah.
Okay. Well, thank you for the question. Yes, I mean, I shortly mentioned, as you have heard, that the case was decided to be unlawful. I think one of the more important things, maybe to put this a bit more into context. So what happened was the so-called Operation Luxor was done a week after the militant attack that killed 4 people and injured, I think, more than 20 people back then in downtown Vienna. This raid was actually not connected to this militant attack. The raid was prepared as the authorities say 1.5 years before. But obviously, I think a lot of commentators said the government really took the chance to use this raid as showing, like, look, guys, how tough we are and how able we are to handle terrorism, right? That was the message that they really wanted to portray in the media, and they were very successful in doing so. But again, it was disconnected from this militant attack. But nevertheless, I think in the overall imagination of most people who do not really read the details, it was very well connected. So it was like that was the answer to the militant attack, and thus, like, the Minister of Interior would present himself at the forefront of fighting against alleged terrorism. Maybe also to note here, back then, Sebastian Kurz was still Chancellor of Austria. And one of the things that he said after that raid happened, he said, quote unquote, we have two big challenges in our country. One is the pandemic and the other is political Islam. And I think that really shows you, right? I mean, how high on the agenda this whole issue is. And one of the problematic aspects, obviously, was, and I mean, whoever is interested, I wrote one shorter piece where I reflected upon some aspects. I can put that in the comment section, so you can go more into detail. And there is actually one very good report that is largely very well written by CAGE and ACT-P, two civil society organizations, on the Operation Luxor. So it provides you much more information that even can be found in my report. So one of the problematic aspects at the beginning was that the suspects did not have any access to the files. So because of that, neither they nor the media would really know what is really going on. And since, claiming that somebody is part of a terrorist organization is nothing minor, there was a strong intimidation that was felt on behalf of the Muslim community, because nobody dared to speak out. After one week after a militant attack happens, who wants to side with people who are alleged terrorists, right? So that was really the perfect moment for them to do so. Again, we are now more than 1 year has passed, and the higher court of Graz, which is in charge of this whole investigation, he clearly spoke when he said this raid was unlawful. Meanwhile, also a number of suspects, actually the number was increased, not only the people who were raided, but also afterwards there were more than 100 people that have been held as terrorist suspects, which is a huge number. And that was the largest police operation in the history of this Second Republic of Austria, speaking of since 1945. Right, so that was definitely nothing minor, like even in the outside of the whole Islamophobia discussion. Still, the investigation is ongoing. Still, a lot of people who are affected by that, their bank accounts are frozen, their assets were frozen, and the state prosecutor has up to 3 years to either file a charge or close the case. And I assume that the case will be closed with all of those people, because it's definitely unsubstantial. Again, it shows us one thing, that Muslims have no political value. You can do everything with them. There were a lot of very famous people, like even the former president of the Islamic Religious Authority, who was the president for 14 years. Right, and a very well-respected person, actually, within the political system, right? He was taken as a suspect. So that shows you really the value of Muslims, politically speaking, is like zero. And at the very same time, it shows you that still the independent justice system is in place. So not only for this incident, also take, for instance, the hijab ban that has been implemented in 2017 when the far right was coalescing with the centrist right. That was also the Constitutional Court in Austria rescinded this legislation, and today we do not have this ban anymore. So I think there are many lessons that people can learn, and also in terms of comparing it to other countries, with France, for instance, where it seems that the justice system is not anymore of any help to a lot of the Muslims who are affected by these severe policies and these hawkish measures that have been implemented against the Muslim civil society.
Thank you, Farid. There is another question directed to Adam. Adam, okay. Okay, I can't see the previous questions here. Okay.
You're unmuted. You're muted, Enes. We cannot hear you, Enes.
Maybe as Anas trying to get back and also get straight, because he's sideways on us right now. So maybe Adam, you see the question in there in the on the notes. So it says, do you see any ideological connections between Islamophobia in the Albanian-speaking Kosovar media and the Serbian propaganda trying to undermine the statehood of the Republic of Kosovo and represent Albanian Muslims as a danger to Europe and the European values?
Just to jump in, because Adam seems also to be to have left us.
Oh, here's Adam. Let's see. Add to the stream. Here we
go.
go.
All right. Here he is again.
Yeah. Hi again. Yeah. Thanks for the question. I would say that there's no direct link. First of all, because Islamophobia, as it manifests in Kosovo, is a consequence out of Serbia's decades-long colonizing and racist policies in Kosovo. So what you have in Kosovo with the majority Albanian, Muslim Albanian population is the internalization of the mindset that has been there for many decades. And another point that shows that there's no real connection with Serbian Islamophobia and Albanian Islamophobia is that Albanian Islamophobia
Seems we're having some technical difficulty on Adam's side and in Enes' side. So Enes, can you, are you able to see us, hear us? Because we can't see you or hear you right now.
You can hear me?
Yes, we can.
Yeah. All right. So, okay, let's continue with the questions. But all right, there's a.
Yeah, if Adam comes back, we'll add him to the stream as soon as he comes back. So
Okay.
there was this question.
Okay, what are the shifts that the 2020 report documented with the European context? Farid, do you want to answer that question? And others also can comment on this with regards to their own country reports.
Well, I mean, maybe I can connect it to one of those questions that came from the Northern Californian Islamic Council, asking about this, the use of anti-Muslim Brotherhood movement and anti-terrorism programs, and how prevalent it is now and what is behind it. Yes, I think that is very much connected, not only for the French case that we have already discussed, but also for the Austrian case. Operation Luxor was basically based on framing the Muslim Brotherhood, which is neither in the EU nor in any nor in Austria seemed deemed as a terrorist organization, based on the framing of the Muslim Brotherhood as a terrorist organization. And I think, from what I follow, also on the Balkans, you have these movements where there are like think tanks from abroad are trying to frame the Muslim civil society, basically everybody that is active, that is doing something, either working against racism or self-organizing Muslim communities, to be framed as a Muslim Brotherhood, tied to the Muslim Brotherhood in one way or another. And then there is this case made that there is some terrorism link. And I think, again, here there are larger geopolitical context in which this operates, this strategy, but the impact it has on European soil and the Muslims living in Europe is that you'll find Muslims should not basically participate, because if they participate, it's an attempt to subvert the European democracies, change the political order. If they do not, then they are kind of living in a parallel society and in their own Muslim ghettos. So either or, people not satisfied, and this is kind of one of the messages, I think, in terms of what has changed, the institutionalization of these discourses. That is really what has changed, because all of what I've been talking about was based on these kind of allegations.
Thank you, Farid. There is a question for Hikmet. Given the growing Russian overtures from the Bosnian Serb president, is it possible that the Russian threat can help garner EU support against rising Serbian aggression?
Yes, to some extent, because currently what we have is a growing UK and US focus right now on the Western Balkans, and that's a great relief for Bosniak Muslims. From European Union, not so much, except for the Netherlands, which is going to impose its own personal sanctions against the Serb Republic. But for example, the US has set up a special forces base in northern Albania, through which they can, in the case of violence, send in a quick reaction, rapid reaction force to Bosnia in a matter of half an hour, basically. So that's something which was most probably a direct reaction to the growing Russian influence. And also the UK has sent in a large high-level representative for Bosnia to see what can be done, and also the role of the UK has been very positive in recent years regarding Bosnia and Herzegovina, and their stand currently is for unified Bosnia and Herzegovina. But again, this is the UK and the US, and also the Netherlands, probably for their role during the Srebrenica genocide, while in the rest of Europe we don't see that amount of support whatsoever. but we'll see how things go on from here. But for Bosnian Muslims, the main support again comes from the United States, and that's what we focus on, and what we hope will come to, and also from NATO, of course. These two things. For the rest, we are not that very much optimistic, nor do we. We have learned our lesson from 30 years ago, so we know who our allies are, and we are basically focusing on that right now.
Thank you. Thank you, Hikmet. There is a question also for James Carr. What is the role colonial history in the perception of Muslims and in producing Islamophobia? Does it play a role?
This is a really fascinating question, because when I saw the question, I tried to just scribble down a few points very quickly, and in terms of if I look at Muslim demographics first of all, and Muslim populations in Ireland, it's a little bit more diverse than we'll see in other countries where we have growing Muslim communities and Muslim populations. So, for example, if we look at the United Kingdom and the connection with Pakistan, India, Bangladesh, and so on, if we look at France and the Maghreb, and maybe also in Spain, it's different in that sense. So our demographics are a little different, more diverse. Now, in terms of the imaginary of Irishness and colonialism and the impact with Muslim communities and the perception thereof, on the one hand, there is this, as a state that was subjugated under colonialism for so long, there's this popular understanding that, we didn't play a role in colonialism. But there were parts of Irish society that did, when we're part of the British Empire, that did engage in that. And in fact, I remember distinctly meeting someone many years ago who spoke with quite clear, colonially informed, shall we say, racist ideas around people in Palestine, for example. There is, in the Irish context, we have in a popular support for the Palestinian people and Palestinian cause, and with the struggle of the Palestinian people. But it's not uniform. It's not with all, and it's different in the Republic of Ireland than it will be in maybe in Northern Ireland, where you have people from the nationalist community identifying more easily or readily with the Palestinian struggle than others. In terms of perceptions of Muslim communities, like, we are heavily influenced in the Irish context by our neighbors in the United Kingdom, and the legacy there of colonialism is clear in terms of even our use of language and our media consumption that we have today. But as a result of colonialism, and as a group that were racialized as non-white for so long, we also have a recognition that Irish people have experienced racism, and it's something that we shouldn't visit onto other groups, Muslim or otherwise. At the same time, what comes clearly through in Islamophobia in Ireland is that the idea of the Muslim is something that's foreign, or presented as foreign, and that our counter-colonial discourses of belonging in Ireland center very much around whiteness and around Catholic identity. So if you're outside of those markers, then it's perceived that are you really Irish sort of idea. So it's a really complex situation in the Irish context, because we're coming from one where we were colonized for so long. And our constructions of self reacted to that, but we're also then influenced very clearly by the broader global context in terms of the constructions of Muslims as well. So it's a fascinating situation. So it's complex.
Thank you very much. There is a question about what are some positive developments in countering Islamophobia. Of course, maybe I can also say a few words here. We've seen that in recent years, international institutions like European Council and the European Union has appointed some representatives to combat Islamophobia. However, the interesting thing here is that, for instance, European Council has appointed a special representative on anti-Semitic and anti-Muslim hatred and hate crimes. And the same applies to European Union. They they have European Union has appointed a coordinator on combating anti-Muslim hatred. So the issue is here that they hesitate to use the word Islamophobia. That we see a hesitation not to use the word Islamophobia, and we've seen also United Nations has published several reports on anti-Muslim hatred. The UN Special Rapporteur on Freedom of Religion and Belief, Ahmed Shahid, he heavily criticized some European states in his report in 2021. So international institutions are slowly and I think gradually getting acknowledging the problem. Also, the OSCE has a representative on anti-Muslim hatred. However, I think that there needs to be more effort here in the international arena. But if you look at the nation states in Europe, there is not much development. This is my let's say, this is how I see when I read all the reports and edit all the reports. Only a few countries report and document the cases officially, like Germany. Others are silent about this issue. Maybe Farid can add some other comments, and also other authors here. They are also free to, of course, contribute. Farid, you want to add something? James or Nadia or Hikmat?
I see also a lot of questions actually to the Spanish case, and I don't know if also to Nadia, so maybe also to give you the floor. I don't know if you're following everything on the sidebar, but there are a few questions I think also to you, so not to occupy too much space here.
There are new questions coming. One is, did Spain's response to Syrian refugees intensify the Islamophobic discourses and renewed the imaginaries around the Moors? Maybe you would like to answer our...
Yeah, so you can hear me?
Yes, we can.
Yeah, okay. So it did a little bit, just a little bit, with the welcome refugees rhetoric. But at the end, somehow, there are levels of Islamophobia, and the Syrian are somehow in a higher level than, for example, people coming from the Maghreb. It's like there are levels of Muslims we prefer. So I would say it has more to do with terrorist acts, because the migration rhetoric that it gets very mixed with the Islamophobic rhetoric is more directed towards, as I said before, towards the youngsters that migrate alone from countries from the Maghreb. But I would say that Syrians are, in comparison, and it's really bad to compare and it's horrible, but I do have to say that there have been some cases where Syrians have reported to have been called a Moor, you know, like, hey, the people who called them Moors were like, oh, you're Syrian, oh, okay, it's so, oh, sorry, like they are somewhat more protected. I at the moment, this is what I feel, while the Maghrebian migration, and not even migration, because we're talking there might be so many generations, or in Ceuta and Melilla, for example, where the population is autochthonous, they have never migrated, and it's for example, it's more or less 50% of the population is Muslim and autochthonous, and but they are foreignized, constantly foreignized. So unfortunately, I do have to say that there are some levels of visually, or the name, or the origin, and so on. So thank you.
Thank you very much. There is a question for Nadia as well. Has there been any efforts to get the European Union to pressure Hungary to uphold people's rights and religious freedoms per the EU Charter?
Yeah, thank you for the question. There have. there was an attempt Hungary was referred to the Court of Justice of the European Union for blocking people crossing the border, but for a number of different violations. And there was a judgment passed in December of 2020, which Hungary is still in effect refusing to amend its behavior regarding this. So this is ongoing, but the European Commission has certainly attempted to initiate proceedings against Hungary. The ruling also suggested there should be financial penalties. This is still ongoing and being negotiated, but even as late as December of 2021, Orban was quoted as saying that Hungary would not be changing its migration policies, and it would not be bullied by the EU either to change its views on migration, but it also couples with this certain other issues. And I know the question also covered religious identities, but it also passed. It also responded to whether or not it would change some of its behavior regarding LGBTQ issues as well. So it kind of lumped together the migration and identity issues into one and made it fairly clear that they would continue to budge on these issues, even considering that there has been a court ruling over this. So I think that it will be interesting to see if they push Hungary with these penalties and if they push them to really, or if Hungary is actually pushed to follow through and respond appropriately. Thank you.
Thank you very much. There is a question, any possibilities of collaboration or advice on getting started on an Islamophobia report for Canada? Hate crimes continue to rise within Canada. For example, the London, Ontario attack in 2020 on a Muslim family being moved down by a truck, several attacks on Muslim women in Alberta, just to name a few. Anybody wants to comment on this question? Yeah, I think it's important to report annually, and that's why I think European Islamophobia report was somehow successful. So, and I think there are enough. I mean, we are not connected to Canada very much. I mean, we are based in Europe. Farid was based in Europe. He is now in the United States. But of course, there are many institutions and NGOs in Canada. I think there is enough. I mean, staff or academic scholars and activists who can do this job. And but it has to be, I think. It has to be published every year or every 2 years. So otherwise, it won't have much impact. That's my fear. Yeah. And there's a comment. A full report is coming forth on Canada from our colleague, Professor Yasmin. Yeah, I think there's a report coming, and that's a very welcoming development. Okay. Let me see if there's another question. There was a question about the rise of far right. Okay. Okay. What role does Islamophobia play in the rising tide of the anti-immigrant refugee sentiments and the drive by right-wing parties to ride it to the election victories? Anybody to comment on this question? Question is not directed to anybody, I mean, specifically, so you can answer.
And if you don't mind.
Yeah, please, James.
I mean, I think we see it. I think probably everyone on the panel will agree that the term migrant, refugee, asylum seeker are oftentimes used interchangeably with Muslim. We've seen this in popular media. We've seen this. There was one image. It's a number of years ago now. It was in one of the, well, when I say a number, like 3-4 years ago. where you had it was in one of the right-wing publications in the United Kingdom, where you had people crossing the imagined border into Europe, which was represented by a sign for European Union, and they were all presented as being like taking a form like of a face veil, or being pregnant women, or guys that were like dressed like in traditional dress or Afghani traditional dress, for example, carrying weapons and having rats at their feet and so forth. And this was, I think it was around the time where we saw, a lot of numbers were really reported in the media for people coming into Europe seeking refuge. So I think it's interchangeable. For certainly in the Irish context, I would say in the United Kingdom context, maybe others could comment as well to that. But I think oftentimes it's just interchangeable, and the scare is put there with it as well. So yeah.
Thank you very much.
Could I comment briefly?
Yeah, of course.
Just to add
Yeah.
to James's comment, if I am thinking of the same image, the image was recycled in the Hungarian political discourse as well. And also some of the images that have been used, right, to promote this far-right attitude towards anti-migration policies have been images from 20, 30 years ago as well. So there's a really interesting recycling of these kind of stock figures of Muslim men in particular walking Europe's borders that I think proliferate across the EU. And I think the case in Hungary is the case in Hungary on this particular point is relevant because the anti-migration rhetoric certainly drives all of the discourse prior to the election. So with another upcoming election, we're seeing this starting to ramp up again, even though it doesn't necessarily drop out of view in Hungary all that much. Thanks.
Thank you very much. There is a question about France. What factors specific to France, perhaps philosophical, historical, would you say, have driven its elite from left to right towards a more militant version of secularism in comparison to the Anglo-Saxon world or Germany, for instance? Differences in rhetoric and policies on Islam are immense. Thank you. Anybody? Farid?
Yeah, I mean, let me take this one. I mean, honestly, I don't know if these differences to other European nation states in Western Europe are maybe more superficial rather than profound. What I see, I think there are different dimensions of this movement that we are seeing. Obviously, one of the aspects that we've just been discussing was the gain for political success, for electoral success. And I think that's an important aspect, but it's definitely in Western Europe, at least, it's only one dimension. The much deeper reason, I think, for a lot of these measures, and that's true not only for France, but also for Germany, but in a different way. You can see this idea about which I've talked at the very beginning, coming especially from the ministries of interior, that the German government wants to create a German Islam, the French government a French Islam, and so on and so forth. I think it's basically the same idea. And I think the way how to achieve it in different religion-state relationships might differ to some extent, but again, not so fundamentally. To give you just one example, when we speak about, let's say, academic freedom and universities, then obviously in Western European nation states, other than, for instance, in the United States, where universities are, in most of the cases, again, not all the time, but most of the cases, they are private institutions. In Europe, they are state institutions. So the state has a large amount of influence in the way how he structures these institutions. So, for instance, the establishment of religious theological institutions is something that the German state is very much supporting. Why? Also, I think to some extent because the idea is that we create loyal Germans who are working for the German sake, for the German state in a larger sense, and who are not per se like questioning the whole infrastructure. So that is something that you can also find on the French side. Though maybe the state-church relationship is so different. And yes, I think this idea of strong secularism, of hard laïcité, is something that helps the French discourse to be tougher on Muslims. But I don't think that it is necessarily so different in the way then how that manifests itself in the way the state treats its own Muslim population. Because again, the French Ministry of Interior, it created a representative body to govern Muslim religious affairs. In a very similar case, the German, when they initiated in 2007 the German Islam Conference, what they were about was actually to find a way of defining the relationship between state authorities and German Muslim associations. So there are similarities, I would argue, and I think the longer strategy of all of these different policies that we see at play is that on one hand, these states try to create their own version of Islam, while at the same time, the intelligence services, the way they treat the self-organized Muslim communities is a very hawkish way of trying to ban them either, or to put them under constant surveillance, as we've seen in the German case. And that with a lot of repercussions, because if you, let's say, are a member of an organization that is surveilled, then you might not have an ability to get a job in the official state service, or you are not able to give you one example, if you sign a contract and you're in the Islamic theological department in one of the German counties, then you're not allowed to give a talk at one of those associations that is surveilled, right? This is part of your contract. So that shows you how the German state interferes in the way of knowledge production around the issue of Islam and activism in the civil society at the very same time. So again, people don't talk about Germany that much, but this is the structure that we find there if we really critically investigate it. Therefore, I would be very suspicious and to really single out the French case. It is the one that is blatant in your face, right? That's for sure. But it is not really the unique case if we compare it to other Western European countries.
Thank you for it. Adam, I see you are back. Do you want to continue with your answer? Adam, can you hear me? He's okay. He's not anymore with us, I think. Okay, there is a question about European Court of Justice ruling. What are your opinions on judgment on European Court of Justice about neutrality policy and head covering, which was a case in Germany, in particular the company Müller? Anybody wants to comment on this question?
I mean, if nobody wants to answer, I'm not aware of the Müller case, but I think the European Court of Justice and also the European Court of Human Rights, a lot of the rulings were, when it comes to religion policies, they are basically supporting and not in contradiction to the national and domestic ways of how these nation states govern minority religions. So it is very often just upholding the rulings by their respective national courts. Therefore, the signals it sends are not necessarily contradictory, but they are not really of any help in terms of anti-discrimination. Yeah. I don't know if somebody wants to add something here.
If you don't mind, if it's okay, just I mean, looking at some of the work on cases like this, and again, like Farid, I'm not familiar with the Mueller situation, but the courts they defer to this margin of appreciationism, I think, to the local jurisdiction that we see with the court cases, but and it can be there's like this non-interference thing in terms of the domestic and religion. If I could just add two very quick things to what you mentioned earlier on, Fred, in terms of the French and German case, Austrian case, and others. I think when we talk about the similarities, we're talking about people maintaining power within societies, right? So we have they want to maintain the status quo in terms of the structure within society. And I think, Farid, was it you or others I've heard speak in the past, talk about they don't have a problem with Muslims when Muslims are cleaners or Muslims are working in factories, right? But when we see Muslim people becoming, as citizens within states into the structures of power within those states, then it becomes sort of problematic. So that's why it reminds me of the case of Irishness in terms of, when the Irish became white. Yeah. So excluded from whiteness when it suited, and very much in line with kind of critical race theory, right? So there's a contingency that, we need these Irish folks on board, so we'll grant them whiteness. So similarly with these having the good Muslim sort of dynamic is interesting as well in this case, or the policed Muslim dynamic, the right Muslim groups, which leads me to something in terms of how we resist these things, right? So one of the questions you mentioned earlier, Enes, was around the what's happening in the European space. What tools are there for us? I've done some work with the Council of Europe over the last 12 months or more, and one of those pieces has been around the general policy recommendation on Islamophobia, which will be published in March. And there maybe are tools that can be used from that can inform how we challenge this Islamophobia. But from kind of the spin-off from that work, an opinion has been published on racialization, for example, which opens up, and if we look at the work of Salman Saeed, for example, the notion of racialization coming, an opinion published on that from the Council of Europe, from ECRI, talking about racialization, talking about Muslim communities, opens up that broader discourse of how we can fit the fight against Islamophobia within the broader racism, anti-racism space, and on a more accepted basis, if you will. So I think there are some opportunities there for resistance, but allies are the key thing, and who's going to be the ally?
Thank you, James. Any other comments on this question? All right, we are slowly running out of time, I think, and I would like to thank all of you for your contribution, for your time. Nadia, Farid, James, Ahura, and Hikmet, and Adem, he is not with us. And thank you very much for your efforts and the contribution. And I would like to again announce that you can download the report from the Islamophobia report.com web address, and the previous reports are also available. So it's all available online and free of charge. So thank you very much, and I give the word back to Hatem. Thank you, Hatem, for organizing this also.
Thank you. It's really the start of the conference and the start of the presentations were excellent. I do recommend for people to access the full report. This is a monumental work to be able to coordinate authors and experts from 31 European countries. I would have to say that even the United Nations ability to actually put a comprehensive type of report on one aspect of Islamophobia with their staff and so on was overwhelming. And here we have a report that covers not only one year, but it's been being produced and published by both Enes and Farid, with scholars on the ground from each of the countries, giving us a window to the specific dynamics that are there. So it's really much appreciated. It's a gratitude. for all your work, and we continuously look for working and connecting and networking on the work around Islamophobia. I'd like to thank all of our presenters, Nadia, Hikmat, Aurora, Farid, and I don't want to forget any, James and Adam, who's coming in and out. I see him here, so I'm going to add him. So he's been joining us and leaving us. It was not part of our effort to do so, but thank you, and look forward to really continue the work. We're going to be taking a break and coming back around 1 p.m. Pacific time. So this was our first 3-hour segment. So we don't want you to be overwhelmed with too much Islamophobia in your mind. So go ahead, take a break, have some lunch, and hopefully in the future we will be gathering in person. So thank you, and look forward to seeing everyone back at 1 p.m. Pacific time.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye. Right.